All right. Looks like everything is up and in place. So let's go ahead and get to work, or not to work. Sorry, just a little Shabbat humor, because tonight we're going to be talking a lot about work. And I want to just say right off the bat, work doesn't always mean work. Every language has a range of meanings for any word. And there are sometimes ways that we use a word in casual conversation and ways we use a word in legal conversations. When we talk about work for Shabbat, as we'll see, we are talking about a legal term. So don't get caught up in, do I get paid for it? Do I not get paid for it? Don't get caught up into how many watts or horsepower you're using or calories you're burning. That's not the definition we're going to be looking for. We're going to be looking for a very precise and very grounded definition based upon Torah and based upon Jewish tradition. We will get back to some of the broader concepts of limits on Shabbat, but we're going to start with work, because that is the part where people get very confused and get hung up. I would also like to say before we dive into it, that if you have begun trying to keep Shabbat and to limit the amount of work that you do, you may have found some difficulties. This is not a flip of a light switch, pun intended, change of lifestyle. This is something that will take time, that needs to be gradually introduced, and is part of an overall worldview that comes from embracing traditional expressions of Judaism. So if you are still struggling, try not to be frustrated. Try to just take 1 or 2 steps at a time, get used to it, and then continue to increase and expand your Shabbat observance. So we go back to Exodus 31 as we see a reminder of just exactly how important Shabbat is. As we talked about last week when we mentioned remembering Shabbat, there are 2 modalities for Shabbat. One of them is to add embellishments, oneg, honor, and all sorts of sanctification, and the other is to limit. And this passage is really talking about the limits. Surely you shall keep my Shabbats. That's our good word, shomer, the same root. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You shall keep Shabbat, therefore, for it is holy for you. Anyone that desecrates it shall surely be put to death, for whoever does any work, and this is our word for the day, milacha, that's the word for work that we're using. Anyone who does milacha on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall you work, or shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Shabbat of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the day of Shabbat, he shall surely be put to death. Thus the children of Israel shall keep Shabbat to observe Shabbat throughout their generations for an eternal covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he ceased from work and rested. Now, if that last section sounds a little familiar, that is because it is immortalized in Vishamru, which we recite every Friday night, and which many of us are accustomed to singing with a very powerful melody. Okay, set aside for a moment the death penalty that comes for Shabbat, as I explained in other classes, most notably in Mishnah Sanhedrin and Makot. The death penalty comes with very strict restrictions of when it can be applied. This was not a cavalier activity. It had to be deliberate, it had to be intentional, and it had to be really being done under not only witness conditions, but with proper warning. So with that aside, you can tell by the text that the avoidance of work on Shabbat is critical to this concept of keeping Shabbat. And Shabbat itself is critical for the relationship between us and God. So work is intrinsic as part of our Shabbat understanding from day one. Now, as we saw earlier in the book of Exodus, in Mishpatim, 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the servant born in your household and the alien as well may be refreshed. So we get a rough idea here that 6 days are full of work. The seventh day is not, implying that work is something that we do on a regular basis, and that the cessation of the work, which is what the word Shabbat really means, the root of the word is to pause or to take a break, is really about finishing that work. And then there is a physical and spiritual rejuvenation that comes from that cessation of work. They are very, very closely tied. It is not it's not just that we finish work because it was prohibited. We also finish work and stop our labors because it has a spiritual and physical benefit. It goes hand in hand. Many people who chafe at the limitations of our work on Shabbat fail to understand, as even Ezra tries to point out in his commentary on Deuteronomy 14, that in fact the limitations are there as a way of giving freedom. As he explains, behold, the Lord took you out of slavery and commanded you to rest so that you would remember that you were a slave. The very fact that we can rest, that we must rest, puts our life now in complete opposite to the life of when we were enslaved. Those that can rest are free. Those that can never rest are enslaved. And if you feel in our modern world that you can never rest, then there are some forms of psychological or economic slavery that are still working upon you. God forbid it be physical slavery. If you feel that work must be pursued 7 days a week, then you are not allowing yourself the freedom to see who you are outside of your occupation, outside of your profession, outside of your job, outside of your livelihood. You must find that aspect of your life if you are to truly be free. And God gave us the prohibition on work in order that all of us would be forced to have that opportunity to truly explore that sense of freedom that comes when our work is not even possible. Additionally, these limits on our work are also a sign of trust. We first get this idea in the discussion of the manna, which predates even the giving of the 10 Commandments here in Exodus 16. And the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread for you from the sky, bread being synonymous with all food that was of core value, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. But on the sixth day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it shall prove to be double the amount they gather each day. On Shabbat, there would be no manna. The man would not come down on Shabbat, which meant we needed a double portion on our day before. This is why, of course, we have 2 chalot for Shabbat as a reminder of that double portion. I've got a lot more than 2 in my background picture today. But that also meant that on Shabbat, when we didn't go out together, we were showing our trust, our reliance upon God. That when God says 6 days will be enough to cover 7 days of eating, that we respect that and we trust that that will be true. So too in our life, our professional work, or any of the labors that we engage in, we have been told that 6 days are sufficient. And you don't need to put in that extra day of work. You will get by just fine. Life will be wonderful and splendid, even if you don't go into that office on that extra day each week. You may feel like you're trying to get ahead. It may even appear like you're getting ahead. And professionally, you might even be getting ahead. But personally, the part of you that actually matters more than your job, that is not benefiting at all from a 7-day nonstop grind. We must trust that indeed our life will be richer if we refrain from that additional day of labor. But what specifics are there for work? So far, we've just heard the phrase melacha in a sort of generic phrase, in a generic term. Well, we saw in Exodus 16 the idea of not gathering manna. We also see that we will not be cooking on Shabbat in that same section. We hear later on Exodus 35 that we shouldn't make fire. We also hear in Numbers 15 that it is prohibited to gather firewood. And in Exodus 34, it's also referenced that a person would not plow or harvest the field. Additionally, from the prophets, as well as Ketuvim, the writings, we know from Jeremiah that we don't carry from one area to another, or what we call one domain to another. And also we know from Nehemiah that a person would not tread on wine presses or load up their wares on Shabbat. But these are sort of general descriptions, or rather more specific descriptions, but don't give us a general understanding of what work is actually prohibited. Surely the phrase melacha covers more than just these examples. And thus, we have to look to the Torah in a little more depth, with a little bit more care, to find out what is actually being prohibited when we are told don't work. And what we end up with are 39 categories. And yes, we just had, half a dozen or more, and now we're jumping to 39. It will make sense if we look at it like this. Exodus 35. Exodus 35 provides a lovely little bit of embedded logic, implicit logic, that if we're not paying attention, will go right over our heads. But when we recognize that the Torah was not given in a Dick and Jane version, it was not given for people to simply open their mouth and be fed like a baby bird, but instead was written in a way that would layer understanding and meaning and implication, and a careful reader would be able to see it without having to expand the text beyond the minimum. Then we can see that there is a very strong teaching right here. Moses then gathered the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. On 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Shabbat of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the day of Shabbat." Moses said to the whole community of Israelites, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take from among you gifts to the Lord. Everyone whose heart so moves him shall bring them, gifts for the Lord, gold, silver, and copper, and that all among you who are skilled come and make all that the Lord has commanded, the tabernacle, its tents, and etc." So if you follow the logic of this paragraph, it is coming in the description of the building of the Mishkan. And the text that reminds us of the keeping of Shabbat really comes in this passage, in this portion of the Torah, as an interruption. We've been given some instructions. We are then told keep Shabbat, and we are given more instructions about the elements of the Mishkan to be built. Well, the logical thing to deduce from this is that if God is telling us to build the Mishkan, and then God tells us to keep Shabbat, then those activities used for the Mishkan must not be allowed to be done on Shabbat, right? It is the Mishkan itself which serves as a template, that something that would be used as an activity for the building of the Mishkan, which was the most holy of objectives a person could possibly imagine, that had to be put on hold during Shabbat, that we would build the tabernacle only 6 days a week. And if something was prohibited for the purpose of building the Mishkan on Shabbat, then all the more so, those same activities would be prohibited for us for any mundane purpose. So to understand the different activities that are included within that definition of melacha, that are in that definition of work, all we have to do is understand what activities went in to the building of the Mishkan. Now, you might be thinking, and I was there myself, 30 years ago, no, more than that now, 35-ish years ago, I was back scratching my head and saying, I don't know, that seems a little far-fetched. Is it really the same concept that we're going on with here? Is the work of the Mishkan and the work that's prohibited on Shabbat, are those really synonymous? Well, yes. And all we have to do is go back not just to the tabernacle, but also to the first description of Shabbat as being a very special day, which is from the beginning of chapter 2 of the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, where we hear about God's completion of creation. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had been doing, and he ceased on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And you'll notice that the root word is our melacha, is our word for work that we have been talking about. And you'll also, of course, notice that vayishbot, the word for cessation, is the word for Shabbat, the same root word that is brought in that phrase. So all the way back at the beginning of the world, when Shabbat is first being introduced as a concept, we already can see that melacha, that this word for work, is embedded in its understanding, in the understanding of Shabbat. And then when we fast forward to Exodus 36, what do we find? Let then Bezalel and Oholiav and all the skilled persons whom the Lord has endowed with skill and ability to perform expertly all the work connected with the service of the sanctuary, carry out all that the Lord has commanded. And again, we have melechet, this word for this type of labor being used for the Mishkan. So both with regards to creation and with regards to the tabernacle, we can see that this melacha, this word, is being used very deliberately. And in the prohibition for Shabbat, when we are told to refrain from melacha, we can thus see that it ties everything together. That which is found on the building of the Mishkan is the work that we cannot do. Obviously, we can't derive the labors of category from creation because we're not God. And God's cessation mirrors our own break on Shabbat. But obviously, we cannot deduce the labors we are prohibited from doing from God's stopping of work, because God does not work like we work. But the word melacha is still there to give us that harmonic link for all of these sections. And one more further connection that we can see between the idea of Shabbat and the Mishkan is in Leviticus 19. Guard my Shabbats, again, using that word shomer, and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Shabbat and the Mishkan put together in one commandment, in one sentence, and one feeling of connection. So then, what do we need to stop doing on Shabbat? Well, the easiest way to remember the 39 categories, or to think about them, is to think about the different categories, the different types of things that were being created for the Mishkan, and then all of the sub-elements that went into that work. For example, we know that many plants were needed for the Mishkan to create dyes, the coloring used for the beautiful fabrics, as well as to create the bread, the lechem panim, which I spoke about in my sermon last Shabbat. Well, if you want to grow a plant, what do you need? You need to sow, you need to plow, you need to reap, you need to bind up the sheaves after you've cut them together, you need to thresh them, to break them open, you need to winnow, to separate out the rubbish from the good part, you need to sort, to pick through it, you need to grind it up, you need to sift. If you remember that good old-fashioned flour sifting style, you need to knead, and of course, the final step would be baking. That's how we turn a plant into bread and other usable items. All of these actions are prohibited on Shabbat. So to put this into the real world, if you were sitting at home on Saturday and you said to yourself, oh, look, there's some weeds coming up outside in my yard. Let me just go out and pluck those. Nope, not on Shabbat. Save that for Sunday. On Shabbat, you don't need to. Your garden will be fine with one day less weeding each week, and that's fine. Likewise, if you were to go out and pick fruit, that would also be prohibited on Shabbat, and other aspects of these as well. We're just doing the surface here. There is much more to learn about Shabbat, but for the moment, we're sticking with the sort of basic categories to help you understand. The Mishkan also required a lot of fabric, a lot of cloth. And the basic steps for creating cloth are the shearing, meaning the cutting off of the wool of a sheep, bleaching to make it white, beating it, dyeing it, spinning it, which are all processes of preparing the wool for its use, by making it smooth, making it colored, and turning it into thread. And then the act of weaving itself, stretching the warp on the loom, making 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads, tying a knot, untying a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches. So all of these parts of creating cloth have to do with the use of a loom to weave fabric together. And all of these are prohibited. Now, the ones that are going to be the most relevant in our modern world on average would be things like shearing. Shabbat is not the day to trim your beard or hair, or things like tying a knot. Tying a temporary knot is perfectly fine. So a necktie or shoelaces are okay, but you wouldn't want to tie up an item to a pole or something permanently, tying it in a way that makes it a secure, long-lasting knot. But a temporary knot is fine. And obviously things like sewing, if you get a tear in your clothes or such, you leave that until Shabbat is over. The other part of the Mishkan on the outside that was seen very clearly were the covers. There were skins that were used, not only cloth. And in order to prevent that, we have to look at what it goes into the creation of those skins. So trapping, to capture an animal, slaughtering, to kill it, flaying, to strip the skin off, salting, curing a hide, scraping, cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters. Now, important that salting here is the process of preparing the skin for use. That's perfectly fine to sprinkle salt on your food. This is talking about making leather. And if you're not making leather, then you're okay on that. I should point out, by the way, in general, because this can get a little confusing, that the actions that are needed for the eating of our food, the cutting up of your chicken, the salting, the spreading of butter, not at the same meal as your chicken, on some bread, all of those are perfectly fine on Shabbat. It would only be if you were doing them as a non I'm eating right now. And as we'll talk about in more detail, of course, we can't cook for Shabbat. So if you are preparing an apple to eat and you want to cut it up, perfectly fine. Don't pluck it, don't cook it. But if you want to cut it with a knife in order to eat it, that's okay. And then, of course, with all of the elements now created, we build the Mishkan itself. And that includes building it or pulling down, extinguishing or lighting a fire, striking with a hammer, which was considered the final moment of sealing the deal, that finishing off of an activity, and the moving of an item from one domain to another. That gets a little complicated. But in general, we consider our homes to be a separate domain from the street outside. And so taking something from inside to outside, or from outside to in, is what we're talking about here. If you go back to my Mishnah class on Eruvin, you can find a lot more detail on this topic. And likewise, if you study Masechet Shabbat. Now, I realize I skipped one that was very important for the modern world, and that is the concept of writing. Writing is perhaps one of the most important activities that we do now that can cause difficulty for people on Shabbat. Some people love to make lists. Some people like to do their crossword puzzles on Shabbat, or do other things that involve the making of letters and writing on a piece of paper or some other medium. Stop. It's going to be hard if you are the kind of person who writes a lot, or who uses a pen as a second feature for their mind. it's going to be hard. I know personally that I am often still struggling to remember something by the end of Shabbat that I thought of or was told at the beginning. And I wish I could write it down, but I need the limit to prevent me from doing it, or else Shabbat would just become like every other day. Writing is one of our most creative, commanding, powerful activities. And as a symbol of human power, we also need to set it down at least once a week. So do learn how to discipline yourself to avoid writing for at least that day. And as always, starting for a smaller period of time, like keeping the different mitzvot as the candles are lit until they are extinguished, or keeping it for the evening, but maybe not yet you're ready for the next day, and then keeping it until perhaps you get back from services. In stages, you can acclimate yourself and get used to the keeping of the mitzvot until it becomes natural and until it becomes something that you won't want to let go of. Like I said, I began keeping Shabbat in stages when I was much younger, and now I could not imagine my life without these limitations, because if there is something that needs doing around the house, fixing something with the hammer, or re-gluing that, or cutting this over here, or something in the garden or yard, on Shabbat, I don't even have the option of doing it. And so I have no guilt when I sit and relax and just enjoy the day. On any other day, I might have a little guilt if I'm not doing all that I should be doing. But on Shabbat, my guilt level is 0, because I know that I can't do those things on Shabbat. And it is a remarkably refreshing experience. I'm sure that most of you are like me and always know that there is more you want to do, more you feel you should be doing. Perhaps you feel disappointed by what you have not accomplished during the week. But on Shabbat, because of this barrier, these limits that are put in place for us, all of that pressure, all of that stress, all of that worry, all of that feeling of doubt and inferiority is gone. Because on this day, none of that matters. Because on this day, I couldn't be doing any of that. And it is a remarkable way to take stock and reset your perspective each week on truly the fact that you have done a lot, you have accomplished, and you should not judge yourself by what is left to be done, but you should judge yourself by who you are. You're not merely the sum of your accomplishments during the week. And just a second, there's a question just popped up for me at least. How broadly would the domain be interpreted? Would carrying a meal outside to eat it there be forbidden? It depends. So like I said, in both the class on Shabbat in for Mishnah as well as Eruvin, we talk about domains more carefully. But in most cases, if there is some form of barrier encircling the area, it's considered to be usually part of a joint domain. So for example, in my house, we have a patio with a lanai over it, and there's a wall that's most around the area as well. So taking something out to the patio to enjoy, perfectly fine. On the other hand, taking something to my neighbor would not work. That would be problematic. Also, does the writing ban extend to texting? I know we discussed how it was in general a no for email, but that feels like a much greater formality than texts. All right, so first of all, from the second half, it's not about the amount of formality involved. This is, it's unhelpful to think of the prohibitions as being built upon a hierarchy of what counts as real work, because that is, if you'll pardon the expression, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, telling you, well, it's not really work, is it? And once you allow that insidious little brainworm to start pushing you of, it doesn't really count, does it? Then we get very accustomed to justifying all sorts of things. However, texting itself, I'm going to hold off on, because we're going to talk about electronics and electricity at the end of this discussion. And since texting is a form of writing that is conducted entirely through electricity, we need a little bit more discussion before we can talk about that. So don't let me stop, don't let me finish without that, but we will loop back to that eventually. All right, so just to have them all on one page, here are our 39 Av Melachot. They're called Av because they are sort of the category headings, and there are many different details underneath each one. Like I said, we have nowhere near the time to go through them all tonight, but it can be very interesting. I will warn you that a lot of the books that have been written about Shabbat in the last 50 years have been written from a very extreme point of view and often include teachings from very particular communities that are presented as though they were obvious and universal, but are often more restrictive than traditional Judaism asks of us. So it's something that's a little tricky. Like I've said before, the best place to start with these types of questions is with The Observant Life, the book I recommended all the way back in our first class. That will get you a grounding and off and running without throwing up too many barriers that have been invented by some communities over the last 50 years. But if you have questions specifically about different activities for Shabbat, I'll help with some tonight. And of course, ongoing, I'm happy to answer questions on a running basis. And just for those that prefer pictures for all of our different types of labor, I'll just put up these two pictures that we have so that you can see what some of these things mean. Some of them, you can imagine, are not commonly done in the modern world. I don't know about you, but I don't go around threshing my grain all that often. But it is still an important category for us to know. And then as we look here on page 17, we can see additional pictures for some of the other melachot that are not allowed on Shabbat. All right, so those are the officially this is not allowed categories of labor on Shabbat. Whenever we talk about melacha, whenever we talk about work or labor on Shabbat, that is what we are talking about. Those 39, done. However, there is still a spirit to Shabbat, a ta'am, a taste, a flavor to Shabbat that is very important. Now, legally, it is absolutely critical that we can distinguish between things that are prohibited from the Torah and things that we are prohibited from doing because of the spirit of Shabbat. All of the discussions about possible capital punishment and being cut off and things like that, that's only for those 39 categories in their biblically mandated forms. The spirit of Shabbat, on the other hand, well, it's important to go a little beyond just the literal finite confines of the 39 labors, as we'll see, if we really want Shabbat to be able to work its magic for us. And as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said in his wonderful book, The Sabbath, in the tempestuous ocean of time and toil, there are islands of stillness, where man may enter a harbor and reclaim his dignity. The islands in the seventh day, the Sabbath, a day of detachment from things, instruments in practical affairs, as well as attachment to the spirit, right? So this island of Shabbat, this island in time, as it's often referred to, thanks to his metaphor here, is something that is created not only by refraining from the 39 categories, but also by structuring Shabbat in a way that gives us even more shelter. Obviously, we also include everything we talked about last week, all of the additions of joy and honor and sanctity, but there are a few other ways we try to protect the time as well. As Ramban points out, it seems to me that we have been commanded from the Torah to have rest on the festival, and by extension also Shabbat, even from activities which are not melacha, meaning not technically one of the 39 categories. A person should not labor all the day measuring grains, technically allowed. Weighing fruits and merchandise, technically allowed, as long as you're not writing things down. Filling casks of wine, again, could be allowed in many ways. Emptying vessels and transporting stones from house to house and place to place. Now, what does he mean by that? If the city is walled and locked by night, meaning that it's all one linked community, they could be loading the donkeys and delivering wine, grapes, figs, and all goods on the festival, so that the market would be full of all forms in buying and selling, with the shops open and the merchants attending and the vendors with all their wares displayed with their coins before them. And the workers would be rising early to hire themselves out for these and similar tasks, as if it were a weekday. Now, the locked wall is, of course, that's what creates the domain that is shared, which allows for the transportation that he's talking about. But in addition to that, you can see there's an awful lot of work that can be done on Shabbat that is not officially melacha. That's why I told you at the very beginning, don't think of work as being just how many calories spent, whether you're earning a salary, whether you've exerted a certain amount of watts or horsepower. It is a technical term. And that means that there are ways to do work that aren't melacha. But that would create, as Rambam points out, a loophole large enough that we could, with a little jury rigging here and there, create a seventh day that is almost indistinguishable from the other days of the week. Right? As he points out, all of this is permitted on the festival and even on Shabbat itself, for there is no melacha in all of this. It is not technically that category. For this reason, the Torah said Shabbaton, which is the emphatic word that comes along with Shabbat, that it be a day of rest and relaxation, not a day of effort. And this is a good and accurate explanation. So we do need to often take a few extra steps to protect ourselves from the encroaching pseudo work that often demands our attention, that often asks to be done, and which we can so easily justify by saying, well, it's not really melacha, it's not really work, so that's okay. And while technically true, and like I said, legally important if we were in a time of the judges for actually adjudicating Shabbat violations, very important to know the difference. Shabbat itself could, with a little effort, become overrun by all of this encroaching almost work. And that would prevent Shabbat from truly being what it's meant to be. So we try to limit that. And one of the hardest things to limit is how we talk on Shabbat. As Isaiah himself points out, if you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath delight and the Lord's holy day honored, which we referenced also last week, and if you honor it and go not your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains, then you can seek the favor of the Lord. I will set you astride the heights of the earth and let you enjoy the heritage of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So when it's talking about our affairs, it means looking to our business. And you can easily imagine, I hope, two people getting together on Shabbat and haggling over the purchase of a cow or a car or a house or whatever you want, or arranging for someone to be hired, or talking about setting up an appointment for their business. All of that is merely verbal. None of it technically violates one of the 39 categories. But as Isaiah points out, we would essentially be trampling across the Shabbat. We would not be allowing Shabbat to be a full day of rest, and preventing ourselves from constantly chatting and engaging in conversation, which draws us back into the other 6 days of the week, is a very difficult challenge. It is especially difficult at a synagogue where you come together, often with people you don't see during the 6 days. And one of the first topics that people always ask is, how are you doing? How is work? how's business, yada, yada, yada. And we need to recognize that while there is some room, especially if a person needs to confide or to vent and looks for comfort to hear their complaints, that perhaps try to at least limit it to only talking about the past rather than the present and future, as a way of giving a little bit more cushion to Shabbat. But in general, if you can, avoid those topics altogether. I promise you, the people that you meet at shul are more interesting than the jobs they pursue. And they have interesting jobs, don't get me wrong, but each one of them is a more fascinating conversationalist if you talk about them than when you talk about just their profession. There was a question in chat: can two people become engaged on Shabbat in a modern sense, not the legal Jewish sense? So in the modern sense, it has no legal standing, like you said, and as such, it's not really a violation. The real question would be, why would two people want to become the engaged light version that is common in the modern world on Shabbat? Is there a particular goal they're hoping to achieve? There's so much more flexibility about location and parties or anything else on when it's not Shabbat. But yes, technically a person would not be violating Shabbat by saying, hey, do you want to get married? Yeah, why not? Nothing violating Shabbat about that. I'm just also not sure what the advantage would be. And last but not least, we need to talk about electricity. You may have noticed when we went through our 39 categories, it didn't say electricity was prohibited. And that is because electricity wasn't around back then. Oh, sure, we had lightning bolts, but no one actually had an electric outlet to plug in their device. And the question of what does electricity mean for Shabbat was asked almost as soon as electricity began to be used by people. And not surprisingly, to those of you who have studied it all, Judaism has talked about electricity. Not technically, because like I said, it hadn't been invented, but it did talk about the features of electricity that are relevant to Shabbat itself. So when electricity was first introduced, unfortunately, the explanation that was given to the rabbis, who were not scientists, engineers, or people involved in electricity, was very misleading. The explanation given to the first rabbinic authorities was that, well, you know, Rabbi, how the gas light works, where there is a big storage place downtown, and then there's a pipe that goes from the storage place to your wall, and then when you turn on the switch, more gas comes out and the light goes brighter. And the rabbi's like, yes, I know what that is. That had been around for quite some time. And the argument that was given to the rabbis, well, electricity is kind of the same. There's a big place downtown that's making this electricity stuff, and it comes through a pipe, a wire, and it comes to the lamp on your wall. And when you turn a switch, the fire that's downtown travels through this wire and comes out and makes light. Well, described like that, of course, it was natural that the earliest rabbinic authorities said that electricity could not be used on Shabbat. It had been described as fire. However, that's not what fire is under Jewish law. Just like melacha, fire has a technical definition. And as we can see from these selections of the Talmud, it's not electricity. So what makes fire fire? Well, first we have to understand when it's not. So Shabbat 42a, Samuel said, people may extinguish, meaning to put out, to dampen, to reduce the heat, a lump of fiery metal in the street so that it will not do any harm to the public, but not a lump of fiery wood. If something is on fire on Shabbat, as long as there is no immediate danger to another person, we don't put it out. Remember, extinguishing fire is one of the prohibited labors. This is why we don't blow out the candles for Shabbat. That's why you always want to light them somewhere safe where they can simply burn themselves out. But we can blow out, extinguish water or something else, a piece of hot metal. Why? Well, as Rashi explains on a different part of Shabbat, a lump of fiery wood is forbidden to be put out because when it is extinguished, it makes charcoal, whereas a lump of fiery metal does not. Putting out a piece of burning wood creates a different substance. Cooling a piece of metal more rapidly by putting it in water or something merely turns it back into cold metal. It doesn't transform the metal in a Jewish, legally meaningful way. Yes, I know there are things going on at the molecular level and all of that. Judaism doesn't concern itself with the molecules of tempering and forging steel. Likewise, the rabbis argue when it comes to the Passover sacrifice. The rabbis argue over the cooking of the Pesach offering on coals. It is eventually established that wood coals do count as fire, but lumps of fiery metal are not classified as fire. So for the Passover sacrifice, there needs to be a certain form of roasting, and that roasting over fire can work over hot wooden coals. It doesn't have to be just a naked flame, but it cannot work over hot metal coals. You can't heat up a bunch of metal till it's super hot and then cook your lamb over it. That would not be fulfilling the mitzvah of cooking it over fire. Judaism has, as a technical definition, fire is something that produces flame and consumes the item that is on fire. That is not the case, again, from a Jewish technical point of view, when it comes to metal. So the basic ruling is that electricity in and of itself is permitted on Shabbat, which is why turning on and off a light switch is considered perfectly fine on Shabbat. However, does that mean everything is okay? And the answer is, of course, no. Right? Electricity is allowed on Shabbat the same way water is allowed on Shabbat, the same way wind is allowed on Shabbat. But that doesn't mean anything you do with it is allowed. There are some things which are okay. Turning on a light switch is the classic example, and some things which are not. The general rule is anything which is prohibited in and of itself, meaning comes from one of those 39 categories, is also prohibited when done with electricity. So you can't say, I'm not cutting, it's the scissors that are cutting and they're electric. Still not allowed on Shabbat. So again, I'm going to always trim my beard, which I do with an electric trimmer, before Shabbat, not on Shabbat. Likewise, you can't use an electric typewriter and say, I'm not writing, it's the electricity writing. Nope, you can't cut wood with an electric saw, you can't sew your clothes with an electric sewing machine. All of those things are prohibited because even if they weren't being done with electricity, they would be prohibited. Manual scissors, pen and paper, manual saw, manual thread and needle, all are also prohibited on Shabbat. Which brings us back to our question that was brought up earlier. Well, what about electronic writing? And not electronic writing meaning an electric typewriter, but writing through the medium of a computer or through the medium of a phone, which people I think use more than computers these days. Whether it be texting or email or some other form of electric communication. And there's no short answer to this because writing is a difficult concept in Judaism. It has its own technical definition of what counts as writing. In general, however, technically, the writing that is done on a screen, whether it be a phone screen or a computer screen or something like that, not talking about a printer, but a phone screen, technically that is not the same type of writing as writing done with a pen and paper or an electric typewriter. Which is why I could type out God's name on a computer screen, and then I can turn off the screen or delete the file even, and I have not violated the destruction of God's name. If I do that with an electric typewriter, if I do that with pen and paper, then I have committed a transgression. So technically, writing through the medium of a computer or phone does not count as writing. However, there's a lot of howevers in Judaism because it's all about details. It does often fall under the spirit of Shabbat. Many of us are so attached to our phone and devices for our common everyday, especially professional activities, that writing through them on Shabbat can often prevent us from fully immersing within Shabbat and that time of relaxation. Now, this is a very subjective idea. For some people, Shabbat is the only time they have to catch up with friends or family, and that's only going to happen through FaceTime, through texting, through logging into the live stream to watch the synagogue service, which means typing tiflorida.org. And that is not technically prohibited as one of the 39 categories of work, but it is still potentially fraught with the danger that once you've loaded up the app to do something which is good and positive, you're also going to check your email account and see what your bills needs paying, and there'll be a reminder about a sale that you were looking forward to, and your mind is now drifting towards those other activities. That doesn't mean it's categorically prohibited, and it doesn't mean it's categorically allowed. Like everything else in Judaism, there is always going to be an element of discretion and an element of refining your own experiences over time. You may find that at the beginning, it is useful to not rule these things out, but over time, you may discover that it is an intrusion, that you just want to mute the phone for Shabbat and just leave it on the bedside table for the day. That, as a matter of fact, you can do lots of what you want to do, and perhaps even more of what you want to do when you're not clutching it 24 hours a day. And it provides an additional incentive for different types of activities and different types of human engagements when we set that down. But it is not categorically going to be okay or not okay. It's going to be very, very dependent. But I will remind you, of course, that using such devices for anything that is in and of itself the wrong spirit of Shabbat, checking in on your accounts, checking the stock market, checking in on your shopping, putting things into your Amazon cart to get ready to buy later on. All of that goes right back to what Ramban is talking about. It might not technically be prohibited, but it is certainly preventing you from fully experiencing Shabbat as it is meant to be intended. Any other questions or comments before we finish for today?
Somewhat on this topic with regards to like electronic video games. That's something that in almost no circumstances at all could be considered work, but has like typed out communication in it if you were like playing with other people and communicating through it. That feels like one of those very subjective areas in which I can't really, unless you're one of the 1 in a billion people who plays professional video games, I can't think of any way in which that could even be violating the spirit. And I'm curious.
That would be one of those places where I agree that if it is an activity that is special to you because it's the one time you can hang out with your friends that are scattered across the country, and it is a powerful social activity, I can certainly understand how for a person in that situation it would be an appropriate activity for them. For somebody, like you said, that is a streamer or is recording their work or plans to make videos of it, then yes, that's definitely where they should take the day off. And you know what? They can make content on other days and relax a little bit from that pressure of being a content provider. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Can we use the microwave on the Sabbath?
So cooking in general is not allowed on Shabbat. And usually heating things up on Shabbat is done with things like a preset stove. Now, in Florida, where most people do not have gas as a preset stove, it's not impossible, although people will disagree about this, to go ahead and turn on the heat for a stove to warm something that has already been cooked. Likewise, a microwave could be used. Again, there are some people who agree, and it's really kind of fuzzy, that a microwave is another way of heating something rather than cooking. But always, when it comes to heating our food on Shabbat, we have to be very careful that the food was definitely cooked before Shabbat, that we are not turning something from not cooked to being cooked on Shabbat, and that we are not engaging in anything that would step over that line. So it really depends on what it is that's being prepared. But if you have specific dishes and such, then you can text me later, and I'll be happy to give you more specific advice.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and finish then for today. Thank you all for studying together with me. And as an early thing, Shabbat Shalom for tomorrow night.